Let's continue with and finish our story about how Jesus cast a demon out of a deaf-mute young man as he was coming back down from the Mount of Transfiguration. And I believe this is probably up on the lower slopes of Mount Hermon, just north of the city of Caesarea Philippi. Let's look at the Mark 9 account because it has a little bit more detail about the end of the event. Mark 9:26. After crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. So it's a very dramatic end. The demon has to give up control of this person now because Jesus is the authoritative third party enforcing the return to free will for this person. Once the demon is gone, Jesus raises the healthy boy back up. He can now hear. He can speak, which is a really big deal to the people around because everybody's amazed. And then Jesus goes inside a building. Verse 28. When he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" Because remember, the father of this boy had come to this location because he'd apparently heard that Jesus was in the area, but didn't find him because Jesus was up on the mountain of Transfiguration. And so asked the apostles who had been empowered by Jesus probably almost a year earlier with the ability to do healings and to cast out demons. So he asked them, "Would you please take care of this?" And they couldn't. The 9 that were with Jesus. And this is probably what precipitated the scribes getting into the whole thing and arguing with them, probably accusing them of all being fakes and frauds. And then Jesus comes down and terminates that problem by casting out the demon. So now these 9 apostles want to know, hey, why is it that we couldn't do this one? And so Jesus has a response that's a little bit longer in the Matthew account. So let's go over there at this point. Matthew 17:20. He said to them, "Because of your little faith." So the fact that you are functioning with less trust than you should have been. And then he says, "For truly I say to you, if you have faith or trust like the grain of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." Now you have to picture the environment that he's in. Just outside the building is Mount Hermon, towering up to over 9,000 feet above them to the north. And so Jesus basically says, guys, the problem is you had too small of faith in this incident. Because if you have sufficient faith, you should be able to tell Mount Hermon, just get up and go somewhere else. And it should happen. And if you have this type of faith, then nothing will be impossible for you. Now, I have a question here. Does this mean that those with faith should be able to go around and do landscaping projects without heavy equipment? Just move entire mountains, move trees, because in another context it talks about about them saying to a tree, "Get up and go cast yourself into the sea." So should Christians in the modern era be able to engage in that sort of activity? And I think the answer has to be that was not Jesus' point. Jesus' point seems to be much more principled. The idea, if you trust God, anything that God has told you to get out there and take care of, you will get done. Because Jesus had told these apostles to go out and do healings and cast out demons. But they couldn't get this one out. Now, why is that? Well, this is where the Matthew account, some manuscripts have this next line, but it's definitely in the Mark account. So let's bounce back over there. Mark 9:29. He said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." And then there are some manuscripts, not the earliest, but certainly fairly early, that add the word "and fasting." And of course, fasting is a ceremony that is connected to prayer, especially in Jewish circles at this time, where you would deprive yourself of food over a specific period of time in order to spend that energy in prayer itself. So the focus is most definitely on prayer. That prayer is the very serious intention of the person engaged in this activity. So what's Jesus saying here? He told them that they were not prayed up enough, that they were not invested spiritually enough in getting this particular demon out. And I think we can appreciate the idea that demons, as created beings, they were originally fallen angels or some sort of spirit being that have different levels of ability, and some are tougher than others. And this particular one, Jesus says, you guys needed more. And remember yesterday, I told you that my suspicion is that they may have been phoning it in, as we say, that they'd assumed over many, many times of successful casting out of demons that they could just say, "Get out, demon," and that would be the end of it. And all of us who have jobs that we have skills and even a sort of giftedness in, we have the temptation to not put as much effort into each and every time we're doing that work, because we assume, I'm good at this, I don't have to worry about it. Well, I think these apostles may have erred at this particular moment in that particular environment. And so Jesus is effectively telling them, you need to be on top of it all the time. You need to be talking to God and understanding it's not you doing this, it's God doing this. And if that involves even going without food in order to get your prayer life solid before engaging a particularly strong demon, then you need to get that done. You need to be invested in this 100%. And so the next thing that happens is Jesus leaves the area where the transfiguration and this event, and I believe also the great confession that took place near Caesarea Philippi. He leaves that area and heads back toward Capernum. Now, Caesarea Philippi is at the foot of Mount Hermon, and Caesarea Philippi is about a day's walk north of the Sea of Galilee. And the Jordan River flows from Caesarea Philippi down into the northern end of the Sea of Galilee. On the east side of the Jordan River is the territory of Galentus, or the Golan, as we call it today. That was the territory of the Tetrarch Philip. The west side of the Jordan River is Galilee, the region of Tetrarch Herod Antipas. And so they apparently crossed the Jordan back into the territory of Galilee and start making their way toward the home base at Capernaum. So Mark chapter 9, verse 30 says, "They went on from there and passed through Galilee. And he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples." So now we find out Jesus is still trying to spend quality time with these 12 men in particular to prepare them for their role after his death and resurrection and ascension. So that means he has to stay away from the distractions of great crowds mobbing him and demanding his attention for miracles and healing and casting out demons and things like that. So he tries to go incognito for this trip from the area of Caesarea Philippi down to Capernaum. And it's a fairly rural area up in that region, and so he probably could pull it off pretty well. And then this is what he specifically is talking to them about. The same thing that he's just begun broaching with them or bringing up to their attention. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men." The word delivered here will later be the same word that we're going to use about what Judas Iscariot did. "They will kill him." Now, we've already had the specifics of that killing in a previous comment by Jesus, and that is crucifixion. And then Jesus tells them again this very important follow-up. When he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. The Matthew 17 account says that the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him. He will be raised on the 3rd day. Now, the Matthew account says they were greatly distressed. The Mark account, Mark 9:32, says they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to ask him. The Luke account gives a little bit more detail. This is Luke 9:45. "They did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them so that they might not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this saying." So at this point, all of them are hearing the words, but they're not comprehending the words being literal. Peter's already chided Jesus for talking about dying and rising again once, and he got chewed out about it. So now they're all keeping their mouths shut, even though they still can't get their heads around this idea that the Messiah would die, because they've picked up on the long-standing teaching of the Pharisees that when the Messiah comes, he will remain forever. The Jewish people of the first century, the religious Jewish people of the first century, believed all of the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah, which we New Testament believers associate with the second coming of Jesus. That is, new heaven and new earth, resurrection of the dead, transformation of the living, the curse is removed, eternity begins and is centered around the eternal kingdom of the Messiah. So these guys have decided they're just going to not ask him and suffer in silent ignorance regarding this idea of Jesus dying and being raised on the 3rd day. And we will see the impact of that on the actual resurrection day when they still don't get it. Matthew chapter 17, verse 24, has a unique bit of information here. When they came to Capernaum, so this is where I told you they were headed. It would have taken them about a day to walk from Caesarea Philippi at the foot of Mount Hermon to Capernaum. More than likely, they took a couple of days doing it because they seemed to be arriving during the normal work day. So when they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the half-shekel tax came up to Peter. All right, let's talk about this tax, so-called. The shekel was the weight of measurement in Old Testament times, before coinage. And in the time of the Exodus, the Jewish people were told, this is in Exodus chapter 30, that every adult male that had been redeemed out of Egypt would need to give redemption money of 1/2 weight of a shekel into the funds of the tabernacle every year. And this would maintain the worship site. And then when the temple came into existence later, the funds collected every year for every adult male, that's 20 years and older, this half shekel would go to the maintenance of the temple. In its original time period, the half shekel seems to have been roughly 1 day's wage. Over time, however, it seems to have become the equivalent of 2 days' wages that would go to this upkeep. So it is a sort of tax, but it is a religious upkeep tax. And it was collected, as far as we can tell, every year shortly before the Feast of Tabernacles. That means probably around the 6th month of the year. And that's effectively where we're at in the chronology right now. So these tax collectors are wandering around trying to make sure that everybody on their list have paid. So Peter lives at Capernaum, so he's on their list. And Jesus apparently is living at Capernaum as well, so he's on their list. So they come up and they said to Peter, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" Because he's not ticked off on the list. And so Peter answered back, "Yes, of course he does." When he came into the house, possibly Peter's house, although Matthew lives in the same area, so it might be Matthew's house as well. So he came into the house. Jesus spoke to him first. So Peter doesn't even get a chance to talk to him about what just transpired. So Jesus is showing some supernatural knowledge here. Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Shimon?" Remember, that's his circumcision name. "From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax?" This is 2 different ways of collecting things for services or out of your income. So who do they collect that from? From their sons? That is, from members of the royal family? Or from others? And when he said, well, from others, because you see, kings don't collect taxes from their own family members. Herod actually is the tetrarch of this area that we are talking about, Galilee, and he was tax exempt or tax immune. His family had been granted that special privilege by Augustus Caesar back in the days of Herod the Great, which probably contributed to their wealthiness. But they most certainly never taxed their own family members. So Jesus says, all right, the sons then are free, aren't they? Now, who's he talking about? He's talking about himself. Remember, this money that is collected every year is to be for the upkeep of the house of God, the worship site. And who is Jesus? He is the Son of God. So why should he have to pay for the upkeep of his own house? That's what Jesus is intimating. But he sets the example. Verse 27, however, not to give offense to them. And this is that word that we run across from time to time about the scandalon or the trigger on a trap. So, not to trigger them then, do this. Go to the sea, and there it is. It's the Sea of Galilee right there in front of you. Cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. Now, these guys are industrial fishermen as their jobs. So they typically caught fish by nets. But if you're only wanting one fish, then yes, they did do the line and hook thing. So Jesus tells him, you go out and catch yourself one fish. Use your hook and net, or your hook and line. And when you open that fish's mouth, you're going to find a full shekel. Take it and give it to them for yourself and for me. So Jesus miraculously pays this year's temple tax by providing a coin that will pay for both himself and Peter. And then that's the end of that story. Of course, Jesus will later go on and teach that all of us should pay to Caesar, that is to the government, that which belongs to Caesar, the government. And so governments provide all sorts of public services and support, roads, schools, fire, police, all of those sorts of things. And taxes are needed to pay for those. So Christians are required, New Testament writing as well, to pay taxes to whom taxes is due. But the really big thing that Jesus is trying to point out here, I think, is that the support of God's work is expected to be taken care of by the members of that kingdom. You hear me week by week encourage you to be part of a local body of believers. Everyone needs to have a home church. Well, you should also be paying into the finances of that church. You should be giving your tithes and offerings there, because that's the only way the work of God in local environments like the churches is going to be supported. Now, at this point, we have something else that happens, and we'll only just barely get started on this today. Mark chapter 9, verse 33 tells us some things we already knew about. It says, they came into Capernaum. We already heard about that. When he was in the house, we already heard about that as well. He asked them, meaning the apostles, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent. And the reason they kept silent after Jesus' question is because of this. For on the way, they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. Now, this time period was marked by great sensitivity to the societal pecking order. Everybody wanted to know where they fit in the structure of society. These apostles seem to be of that same mindset. Now, what precipitated this heated discussion? I would suggest to you it may have something to do with the fact that 9 of these guys could not cast out that demon recently, but 3 of them weren't there. And something might have been said about if they had been there, they would have been able to do it. And we also remember that the 3 that were missing because they were part of the inner circle that was with Jesus up on the Transfiguration Mount. So all of the elements of tension regarding who among them is ranked where is present amongst the 12 apostles already. Luke's gospel puts it this way. It says, an argument arose among them as to which of them was the greatest. So they are all about, I think I rank here, or I think that guy ranks there, or you're not anywhere, there's no way in the world you'll be higher in the rank than this person. And so that's the debate that they had. And when Jesus asked them about it, they clammed up. So what does he do? First, Mark 9:35. He sat down and called the 12. So he brings them in for a little private session here. And he said to them this very basic principle of servant leadership. He said, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. So Jesus is going to repeatedly tell them that they have got to act as servants. The last time on his ministry period before his crucifixion that he will give them a lesson about this is when he washes their feet in the upper room. And he will tell them again pretty much the same thing here. If you want to be a leader, if you want to be great in the kingdom, then you need to turn around and be the servant of everyone else. And then he takes a child and uses him as an example. And when he's talking about a child here, I think it's talking about a preschooler, a kindergartner, maybe low elementary age, a child that still has great trust. Let's finish up with the words from Matthew 18. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, well, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? So apparently they're still wanting to know. And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them and said, truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Come back tomorrow and we'll get right back into God's Word.